Hello class, welcome back to our AMI digital learning. So for you econ kids, this is the first time I've ever done this. Mostly you've been doing Newsella articles or different videos that I've been posting for you, but today I want to kind of go over some government spending just real quick in a video, informative video, before you start doing your individual work and answering our discussion post for today. So this new unit that we've entered into is a part of our national economy unit, in which we're going to be looking at federal taxation and federal spending, which actually plays quite well into some current events that we're fixing to get into a little bit later on. There's some big questions that appear whenever we talk about government spending and government taxation. And it really boils down to what is the role of government? What should the government be doing to help us in our lives? Should the government be helping us? These kind of fundamental ideas of what services should the government be offering to the people? Should the government's goal be to create a more equal society? You guys know that's why we have the three major economic systems in the world, capitalism, socialism, and communism, is because different people have different ideas for what this fundamental question of what should the government be doing for us. Well, within our country, you guys know we have a capitalist free market economy, but we definitely have some socialistic tendencies. We're really going to be looking at that today and really figuring out, well, you had a lesson in which you looked at taxation, but now we're really going to figure out how does the government spend its money and what services do the people receive through this government spending of your taxes or revenue that the government collects from you guys or your parents as of now, unless you go shopping. Anyways, moving on. Okay, I want to show this visual here real quick. So you kind of have this pie chart to go off of. Remember, anytime that you look at a chart, first thing we want to really look at is that title before we really look at the chart itself so that we have an idea of what this information is going to be covering. So our title here, Total Federal Spending in 2015. So that was 5 years ago. But what we see as far as how the federal government is allocating, which by the way, we will only be talking about the federal government today when we talk about federal spending. We will not be diving into local or state governments. But as far as the federal government, this pie chart shows us a little bit of their spending habits, Congress, whenever they make these budgets. And as far as these different categories, although the dollar amount has definitely changed in the last 5 years, as far as which category tends to get the most spending has not changed. So if we actually look here, you can see that there is a lot of things that the federal government is spending money on. That's one reason why the federal government's budget is so high, increases every year, because what they're spending on is increasing. If we look here, though, we can see that our federal government is spending mostly, or most of funds are allocated to Social Security, unemployment, with the next thing being Medicare and health care for the needy in the United States, with that third largest category being military. Now, generally, if you were to ask students, what does the government spend most of its money on? What I've seen in the past, anyways, is students are inclined to say the military. Students are generally not inclined to say Medicaid or Medicare. And this is not surprising because we are a capitalist nation. The idea that we spend more on social programs is kind of confusing with the ideology that America is, not socialist. But just like we talked about last unit with macroeconomics, you can say one thing, but whenever the going gets tough, it's something different. And for spending in the United States, we want to be capitalist, and we quite are capitalist in some ways. But Social Security, which gives sums of money to the elderly to help them survive and get by, That's not something that we're probably going to take away just because, the idea seems horrendous, even though that is quite socialistic. So if you look in 2015, our government spending was $3.8 trillion. If you look here just last year, 2019, that was $4.45 trillion. So we are increasing every year. And next week, I plan for us to really just dedicate an entire class looking at this idea of national debt. And I'm going to have you guys really read some articles to kind of decide if you think this is a national issue. Okay. We're not going to talk about a whole lot of federal programs here, just a couple. So Social Security, which I already gave away earlier, basically gives sums of money to elderly to cover their living expenses, help them get by. And then we have Medicare. You can think of Medicare as insurance, health insurance for the elderly. Then we have Medicaid, which is another health insurance program, this time for individuals low income, lower socioeconomic statuses. And these are technically all examples of welfare programs, but these provide for Americans in need. And these kind of programs have only increased ever since the Great Depression and the New Deal's programs that we saw from that. So basically, once a year, Congress gets together and Congress actually decides, so moving forward, how are we going to spend American tax-paying dollars? What programs and what categories should these funds be allocated? So we call this taxation revenue, the spending, the fiscal. And then we have the fiscal year, which is that actual planning period on which Congress gets together to decide the fiscal year. We have two major categories within all this. We have mandatory and discretionary spending. Mandatory spending is spending that the federal government must do. You can think about it as they do not have an option. It is mandatory. And a good example of this is Social Security. Basically, the federal government cannot decide to just suddenly stop paying or giving elderly the income that they need to really get by. They cannot just suddenly, Congress cannot just suddenly say, okay, well, Social Security is just too expensive. It would make them seem inhumane, and if that was able to get passed, the people who decided that would not get reelected next term. So the idea of just not spending on Social Security is not an option. And then also the idea of trying to decrease that spending is also really hard. Where are you going to draw the line and say, we've promised Social Security to your whole life. Well, now it's just too expensive, so these people are not going to get it and these people are. And that's the reason why Social Security is just so expensive, why the federal government spends so much money toward Social Security, because it's really hard to limit. And it makes people who want to limit it seem inhumane. Then you have discretionary spending. And discretionary spending is spending in which the federal government really has a bit more leeway as far as how much they're really going to spend. This spending is not normally optional in the way of completely deciding not to spend it. It's more like discretionary is I have an option of how much I'm going to spend. A good example of this is defense, military spending. Through different times in American history, we've spent more on defense than others. And certain presidents really pushed forth with more military spending as well. One of Trump's stances whenever it comes to federal spending has been to increase military spending. So if we actually look here at this chart for the fiscal year of 2019, you guys can actually take a second to look at this. Most federal spending is mandatory, with a little bit being discretionary, and then you have the interest. And that interest is interest paid on American debt that our government, or money that our government owes. Okay, so that leads us to federal deficits. So you can think of a deficit as the difference between what I make and then what I spend. If you spend more money than you make, well, that's a deficit. That's a negative number. Every year, our federal government does this. We have a negative balance. Basically, the federal government is spending more money than it is making through taxation. And if you guys actually look at this chart here, where at the top we see spending, revenues, and the deficit, we can see that just last year we had a deficit or a gap of $0.9 trillion. So our federal government was negative almost somewhere between 1/4 or 1/5 of all of our federal spending. We were negative. So that brings to the question of how do you pay for this difference, this deficit? And the major way is through national debt, through actually accumulating more debt. And this means because we have a deficit each year that the federal government is accumulating more and more debt. Our current debt is over $22 trillion. That was as of 2019 anyways. Most students know that our federal government has debt, but whenever you ask students, who owns that debt, and most of the time students think it's outside nations, when in reality, most of the debt is actually owned by Americans, American investors, through purchasing of bonds, for an example, which I plan for us to talk a little bit more about this in the future. But bonds are basically whenever you as an individual decide to buy some government debt. So that means that you allow the government to borrow money from you with the idea that in a certain time frame, the federal government is going to give that back. Generally with a little bit more, which is that interest, which is why people do it in the first place. And because it is the American federal government, it is very secure, and people generally like putting some investments in this because they know that they're going to get it back. Now, about 40% of our foreign debt is owned 40% of our debt is owned by foreign nations, the largest two being China and Japan. Like I said, next week we're really going to dive a little bit deeper into what does this really mean. All right, guys, so the last type of government spending that we're going to be talking about is going to be, goodness, if I can figure out where to put this. Okay, is going to be stimulus spending. So basically, stimulus spending is when the federal government actually spends money in a way to help the economy to recover and help to really speed up or develop economic growth in the first place. So if you guys have been watching the news, which hopefully you have, or at least reading articles on your smartphones, those things that pop up every now and then, and you generally just kind of like push your middle button and go to a different app. If you actually read those sometimes, you would know that last Friday, federal government made history in which we saw the largest stimulus package ever signed into law, which was $2 trillion, an effort to help stop the economic decline that's been prompted from the coronavirus. So we have a very large spending package in which the federal government is trying to spend money. The federal government is trying to actually spend money to help our economy recover. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into that because I want you guys to do your own research. But I am going to tell you that this stimulus package is very interesting in the way in which that spending is not just big businesses, but if you actually look at the spending, what's very unique about the stimulus package, is the way in which the funds are allocated to different parts of our economy and different levels. So I want you guys to do your own research, in which I want you to, if you like reading articles, go ahead and read some articles. If you would rather just skim through some websites, do that. If you want to watch some of those news feeds, if you type in this question on Google, I'm sure there's news feeds that'll pop up. I want you guys to basically do your own research and try to figure out what was all included in that $2 trillion stimulus package that was signed into law Friday. And how will these funds, or that $2 trillion, how will that be used to help the American people? So I want you guys to figure out what's really included in this, and how's that going to benefit our economy. That the last part of this discussion question you guys are going to be answering, I want you to think about, do you think that the government is spending too much money helping to recover our economy, or do you think that they're spending too little? I want you to think about, does the government have an endless supply of money? Where does this money come from? We did talk about the deficit. Think about that. How just last year, almost somewhere between 1/4 and 1/5 of all federal spending was negative. So the government was spending money they didn't really have. So I want you guys to think about these things. The government spending too much money in an effort to help the American economy, or are they spending too little? I want you guys to answer this on Google Classroom using that online discussion platform like we've done a couple of times. And I want you guys to respond to one other post as well. Now, that initial post needs to be at least 3 sentences long. With this kind of question, though, I think you can definitely give me more. I definitely want to see some meat. If you guys do the 3 minimum, I want to see some meat to that those sentences. In addition, that decide on one student to comment on instead of saying simply something like, I agree. Try to bring maybe another comment as far as some more information to that post, add to it, maybe debate a little bit if you can do so in a very polite, civilized manner, which I'm sure you guys can. But try to bring something to the table, basically, with that comment. All right, guys, so like normal or like usual, if you have any questions, any confusions, you can definitely reach out to me using that remind code. You can reach out to me via email, but I'm here to help you if you need it. All right, guys, have a good day. Bye for now.